prop. I'm sure it's not going to be my last. What an incredible session on AI. That was great. It sets a really high benchmark, Gordon and panel. That I don't know if I'll live up to it. Certainly your slides are going to be better than mine. And just want to thank the team and everybody that's come on board. We're now 5 hours into our event, so this is where things, if they were supposed to go off the rails, would have gone off already. So I think we're going off fine here. So I am going to share my screen. Let's see if this works. And we're going to talk for the next hour on, and I see some people coming in, which is great. We're going to talk about future Grey Swans, and we might need a level setter up to start with in terms of what the heck is a Grey Swan. So, and I want to give quick commendation for Jill on all of her visuals. This is kind of our parent visual that leads us off. She created one for me. Sometimes I don't question who this woman is. What is she doing? How do I intimate her line of crossing between past and future? It's something for more creative people like Jill. But it is kind of this, we are in this liminal zone of, we kind of have come out of something. Like in no history of mankind has there been a year and a bit where people have just gone back into their caves for a full year. And now we've come out of it to something completely different and maybe unsure and uncertain in the future. So we're going to try to get a little bit ahead of the future. So a little bit of a level setter for everybody, because you may have come into this going, what is the Grey Swan Guild? Who are we and what the heck is this term? It is an actual existing term. It's mainly from the economic group of people, so economists may know it. It's a potentially very significant event that is considered unlikely to happen, but still possible. And because there is a slight event, it can be anticipated, it can be probably measured, it can be projected forward, and particularly it may shake up the world, culture, politics, economy, ourselves, the stock market, how we lead our lives, both personally and professionally. So I thought maybe in terms of a lunchtime break for us, I thought we'd go big picture and try to get in front of some of the Grey Swans that are going to happen in 2021. And as we can already see, like, it's funny, we started talking about the Day of the Swan back in January, and we thought to ourselves, what could possibly happen more than pandemic? And sure enough, very unpredictably, certainly Australia had its first run-in with big tech in terms of media, and who pays for content now? Like, journalists do, right? Media entities do produce stuff, and there was a big confrontation around the world, which has caused billions of dollars to go back and forth between different entities in terms of who is actually producing content and allowed to deliver it. And then we had GameStop. I think you mentioned it, Gordon, or I think somebody mentioned it earlier in the discussion today. I talked to bankers and brokers on this, and this has brought them to their knees. I mean, if there's a company as small and as insignificant as GameStop that can change the marketplace and either make people fortunes or ruin people, pretty interesting stuff. And I think there's probably some impartable lessons to other industries in terms of the complete disruption and democratization that happened into a heretofore pretty protected industry of finance. And then finally, I don't know of a boat short of Steamy McBoatface that got more memes about things than this poor little Suez Canal evergreen boat that got stuck. But you think about the billions of losses that people experience from all the delays. You think about what people had to do, certainly different types of ships that had to go around the Cape, and so spend an additional few weeks, and just the amount of energy that it takes to move one of these ships. And I just saw the other day, there's another ship somewhere 200 miles off the coast of the North Sea that's stranded and drifting. And so you really do look at supply chains and trade with a little bit of a different lens. And there's this ongoing situation where we're trying to localize a lot of those things, and maybe through 3D printing and a whole bunch of other things, get a little bit closer and spend a little bit less energy on getting our stuff. And so already within 2021, we have 3 of these things. I am sure every month we can probably look back at 2021 and say there's 9 other things that happened that we haven't been able to predict that are going to have just as big of an effect. So that's what we're going to talk about in this discussion today. And before I go on, I mean, tell you what, we'll throw it out to anybody that's interested to serve up before we go to our main discussion. any big predictions people just are so passionate about, they just have to get off their minds? I'll throw it into the brood and see if anybody is percolating anything.
I'll have to go with Black Lives Matter, Shawn. Serious stuff.
Say more in terms of where it's headed, Rob.
Well, Black Lives Matter as a Grey Swan, sort of predictable, huge impact in the U.S. It may be a U.S. Grey Swan, but it's shifting policy, it's shifting governance, it's shifting awareness. I think that it changes the future. It already has in some elements, and then the worlds close by are watching and adjusting. We saw that shift over with the same sentiment of reaction by the public in Asia, assaults and hate speech happening now, and that's come to the fore. I think that we've got a new way of thinking about as a community of how we can respect each other and then change historic problems.
Agreed. And I think it may morph into different directions as well, Rob. I mean, we've already seen it probably. There's maybe a second wave of Black Lives Matter too, in terms of just where it's gone to. And we're experiencing something this week in Minneapolis where there's been another, unfortunate death of a Black youth, and just causing us to go, look, I thought we had covered a lot of this a while ago, and it just popped its head up again. So I don't think it's going away. Back in the early days of the Guild, we actually surfaced a question to people, and I thought it was probably apropos to bring it back up again. We very clearly asked, 300 enlightened souls within the Guild at the time. We said, what is a future Grey Swan that we will have to confront ourselves with? And we asked about 25 different options. I thought we would surface this to begin with, just to maybe set some context for our discussion. So of the 25, and I'm doing this in the order of from 7 to 1 here, people forget, like, what were we talking about in February 2020 before, a place called Wuhan, China had actually, surfaced on our maps? We were talking about a trade war. We were talking about trade wars between China and the US and how it was getting worse and where it was all going to go down. And so number 7 was trade wars. Number 6 was mass unemployment. And I think with the initial shock of COVID, people were looking at it with the distress of what will happen to us all financially. Number 5 was new virus and more pandemics. And it's interesting, the human resilient spirit. If you look at some of Nate Silver's work in terms of his polling, people in about a 4-week period of time went from, I am worried about my health and I'm worried about what this means for me and my family and my outer family and people in my workplace. In about a month's time, they went from, I'm worried about that, to, I'm worried about my personal economics. And so even though it's 5th, certainly it's still prominent. We're seeing different strains of viruses. So this would have been answered before we had seen the Brazilian and the South African and a number of different strains. So people are worried about this, but not top. Number 4 was economic financial downturn and spiral. Certainly, we had seen that over the last 4 years in terms of just where was the economy heading. And so we will keep going down in terms of, it's funny, before even Black Lives Matter had a real spiking moment, I think George Floyd would have been probably June or July of last year. So it would have been actually before we had experienced that. People had said class conflict and strife was going to be big. And certainly if I look at the biggest meta trend from 2019, it was polarization of society. Difference between Republicans and Democrats, and difference between wealthy and the poor, and difference between different racial divisions across society. And so number 3 was class conflict. Number 2 was, we're going to have a crisis and a climate reckoning soon. And there's both the long term, how do we get to 2050 and kind of get in front of an undeniable kind of climate warming. And I think at the time we would have experienced some hurricanes, some different types of things that would have made us a little bit unsettled about the future. Anybody want to predict? I'll spend 30 seconds kind of providing some level of dramatic pause here and go, well, I've covered off the top 6 of 25, but I'm missing the number 1. The number 1 thing we all thought would be a big Grey Swan. So I'll allow you to write it in chat for the time being and see if you're right. Some of you might know the answer, but don't lead the witness too much. What did we all think back in May, June of 2020 as being the biggest thing that will probably rock our next decade? So throw something in chat. And I could sing Jeopardy music, but I'll be off key. So I'm going to do this in 9, 8, 7, 6, 3, 2, and 1. So get your answers in. And it was a cybersecurity breakdown. And so we had seen certain things come up from the election. If everybody remember there was this guy named Trump in power and this other guy named Biden, and it seemed to rule most of the world's headlines. And people were worried about fake news, and people were worried about hackers again in terms of what they might do to the election. And I think in general, people are worried as a long-term type of thing in terms of the more open we get, the more dependent we get on technology, the more vulnerable we are to cybersecurity. So I was interested in your session, Gordon, that you did have a lot of cybersecurity pros, and really this was maybe something 5 years ago, 10 years ago that would have been pushed to being a niche discussion amongst tech experts to now being a very mainstream discussion amongst people around how do we protect ourselves? How do we regulate stuff? How do we stay private? How do we know when fake is fake and real is real? And how do we all do this in a digital context? And it's just got that much more difficult in the standpoint that COVID has probably accelerated our digitalization by about a decade's time in a span of about a year. And so you've got people now in spaces that they haven't occupied before. How does it all happen? So I'm going to open this up at some point, but I have, let's be clear here. Myself and Andrew run a company called Futureproofing Next, and people go, oh, you predict the future. Nostradamus was pretty good at it. I'm sure if you believe in a god, he's probably pretty good at predicting the future too, or she. But short of that, I don't know too many people that predict the market well. There's a reason why casinos make money. There's a reason why the marketplace tends to be, even though you think you figured it out, generally, when you figured it out, all of a sudden you become Merrill Lynch and become bankrupt because something sideswipes you. And so nobody gets to predict the future. I know we talked about Star Trek in the previous segment. Certainly if you're into time travel, maybe I will allow the consideration that somebody may travel back in time and try to figure out what's the future going forward. But shy of that, we can't predict the future. But I have thrown out here 5 provocations about what will maybe happen in 2021. And it's principally based on 3 things. What are some really prominent themes I'm seeing more of? What are some of the early signals that I'm seeing that probably spell kind of something that may lead to a rock going downhill and creating, no more moss, but more traction and momentum for that theme? And what are the implications for the now? So hopefully I'll cover some of these and I'll give you a sense of what I'd love to see from some of our esteemed group of people that have joined us for the discussion today. So here's my first one. And please we shouldn't record this, because if these are wrong, I am going to be so wrong 9 months from now when they're out there, but I'm throwing it out there for people. So let's go with the first one. It's funny, in the US, and I know a number of us are from the States, back in 2019, polarization was such a huge thing. In fact, if you're a Republican or if you're a Democrat, more than half of you believe the other side is definitely not listening to you and is definitely immoral, right? Those are actual stats. And so I'm actually seeing a shifting of that to potentially our rifts and boundaries based on who got vaccinated and who didn't. And some of that may be belief systems in terms of who I can trust and do I get a vaccine. Some of it may be I'm in a country that might not have as great of a vaccine program as somebody else. But I am seeing early signals of signs of, am I allowed in that hotel? Can I bring my kids in who might be the last people that join the vaccine parade? Will they be allowed to travel with me, or do I have to travel alone? If you're in a public space, we've already seen it with masks. Will it be with vaccines? And so I really do think over the next 9 months, we're going to be seeing a lot more headlines around different blow up moments, different thoughts around vaccine passports and how to track this. I think that's an implication for governments in the now. And so that's headline number 1 for me. I won't go too deep into each of these because I'm really interested to know what some of your future Grey Swans are going to be. But I really do think there are going to be rifts and fault lines around who's getting vaccinated. And just as a small little moment too, we felt quite proud about ourselves as Canadians that we thought we were doing a better job about reining in the pandemic. But as we look at who's got vaccinated, I think our latest stats, and Rob, you can bear me up because you're the numbers guy, but I think we're around maybe, and Rob, I think, got his the other day. We're about maybe 5 or 6% in terms of just, at least the double jab. The States is about 5 times in front of us. So as much as we were feeling great about the early days where we were probably argumentably more in lockdown mode than the US, certainly in terms of vaccines, the US has vaulted ahead of us. And I think we're seeing some of those geographic lines around the world. So I'm also going to pivot. We talked about, I think we've talked in 2 sessions already about blockchain, and we've had this concept. I could have put it as my 4th biggest Grey Swan that's already happened this year. Enormous amount of wealth has transferred back and forth with NFTs. This is the newest, latest rage of both investment property and how you might be able to, connote property ownership based on something. And so generally in the first few months of this wave, it's been about creative and video and media, somehow protecting it and owning it for people. And for those that don't know what NFT is, I always get the pronunciation of that middle word wrong, but it's is it fungible or fungible? I think it's fungible, but somebody will correct me on that, tokens. And so it's based on blockchain. And this is really bringing this into the mainstream. I believe over the next 6 to 9 months, there is going to be a complete ethical quandary in terms of people putting stuff online that is owned by them, but potentially sellable to others, that is based on an NFT. So imagine somebody selling their liver or selling their heart or selling body organs that might have been much more public domain, certainly in a different context. Imagine somebody, perhaps a down on the luck student, selling 5% of their future salary in an NFT and having people debate and actually buy into that. There's probably other things where, certainly from a regulatory standpoint, from a legal standpoint, and from a cultural standpoint, we're going to have to weigh in terms of what things are going to be allowed to be put on NFT and what things will be outlawed based on either a global or a national perspective. So that's my second one. Perpetual education restart. I believe, and I've seen it time and time again, certainly university students. There are many university students that are not going back to university in September. In fact, we have had our first bankruptcy of a university since the post-war in Canada. There's a school called Laurentian that has had to completely reconfigure itself and bring it down to its studs based on a lack of students. And so what seemed to be an industry that was almost without fail over the last century, 2 centuries, is now really put under the crosshairs. And honestly, if I was to look at a grading sequence, and this isn't a slight on teachers, but if I was to look at industries, I think healthcare jumped into the void really fast because it had to. I think business pivoted to digitalization of its industry. I think education, writ large, not everybody, but writ large, has kind of slow-footed itself through this, where people have looked at what is the true value of an education, both post-secondary and inside schools, and the safety and everything that's in there. And so I think it's really put under the scope, which we'll see over the next year. Why is it that the only education we lean on generally in life is the first 4 years of our post-secondary sphere? Some people go on to 6 or 8 years. Shouldn't this be a lifelong learning thing? And I think we're seeing a lot of the rifts and seams happen already. Last couple, I think travel isn't coming back for a good long period of time. In every single piece of research we've done, people go, look, I'm looking forward to getting back out to restaurants. I'm looking forward to meeting my friends, my family, but I am not looking forward to jumping on a plane, a boat, a train. That's a bridge too far. There's way too many things to consider there. So I think the travel industry, unfortunately, may still be in another 18 to 24 month ride trying to get its feet again. The one thing people have said is the moment somebody produces a concert that I'm allowed to go to, I think there's going to be a rubber band snapback where concerts tickets will be more valuable than they have ever been in the past. Anything that's entertainment in the public domain, and there is some historical pedigree here. If you look back at the 20s, you had the Spanish flu that started the 1920s. Young people, old people were dying, certainly a lot more than proportionally what we're going through now, given the fact they didn't know what was going on. Why did the Roaring 20s happen? And it's interesting, we're having a cocktail hour later on today that's focused on the Charleston Fizz, which is part of the Roaring 20s. people flooded back to speakeasies. And even though prohibition was still in order, people were going to different shows right after one of the most major landmark moments of their life. So my prediction here is, whether it's sports and entertainment and other things, we will flock back to it in a public domain. And then the final thing, I personally believe, given all the digitalization that's happened, given all the online ordering that people have had, and it's funny, just neighbors that I talk to argue about whether their package is going to show up in hours or days, right? That would have been a mythical debate even 5 years ago, right? We just knew you're ordering something from around the world, you're going to wait 3 to 7 days. I've got a newspaper subscription or a magazine subscription. Even though it's on the stand, I'm probably going to have to wait 5 or 6 days before it arrives at my house. We're now measuring these things in hours, and I think the appetite is relentless. I think already in certain parts of the world, drones and autonomous cars are already playing a role. I think we have probably shifted the public impression in terms of how allowable, what they should regulate. I think that argument's probably being pushed 5 to 10 years forward, and we'll start to see the mainstreaming of drones and autonomous cars really in places that are populated and are probably hungering for these things now, but probably based on some regulation and some cultural shifts, weren't accepting that maybe in 2019. So before I go into the positive, because I think what I've talked about might have negative implications for a lot of people, I'm going to go off screen here and I'm going to open it up to the crowd that's joined us. And if you can look into some of the early signals that are happening that you yourself are seeing, what are some of the gray swans that some of you, our audience, are thinking about deeply? And I'll throw this open. Just anybody raise their hand in terms of what they think. Everybody's like me. They don't want to step their head in the guillotine and actually be recorded on file as thinking that, let's make up something here. Justin Timberlake will revive his career over the next 6 months. Nobody wants to make that claim.
I'll give you something to start with, Shawn. One of the things that was interesting to me is when we got into the lockdown moment and people started to take a greater care for where their food came from and how it was produced, and including starting their own backyard gardens in ways that we hadn't seen in a long time. It's always been of interest to me, but in that moment, I found myself doubling down on all of that too and enjoying it. So my question or my thought is almost, was that a red herring or is it going to stick? Because the minute I can go get food easily and cheaply without fear, am I going to just fall back into that? Am I going to just go eat out all the time? It'll be interesting to see how that works out in our economy.
It's funny, in a recent session, Gordon, we talked about people that had acquired a new skill during the pandemic. So 60% of the world has acquired some new skill given the time and reappraisal of how we're spending it. The number 2 thing that was on that list in terms of what people learned was cooking. They learned to cook something new. And so I think not only did they say they learned something, but half of those people that said they learned something also said they're going to turn it into some type of money making or some type of business operation. So I imagine we're going to see a lot more, mom and pop businesses that exist fully online, focused on food, to your point.
Yeah, I remember that from the Guild surveys. And my question is it going to stick? I think people feel that in the moment, but will they truly live it out a year from now? That'll be the question I have.
I think there's a lot of, once again, Nostradamus probably very good at answering that question. I do feel pretty good that if for no other reason, that we found time in our calendars, right? If the average person commuted to work, certainly in Canada, we have horrible commutes just because we're an urbanized culture, despite all of our land. The average person was saving about an hour just physically in commute time. So, I think there's just time to spend on something outside of, that otherwise wasted time. Other thoughts from people? I know there's a lot of smart people in our crew today, so there are no dumb gray swans. In fact, if somebody said a boat was going to get stuck in the Suez back in January, we might have thought, well, that's a little bit crazy, but it happened.
There you go. I'll throw it out there to see how everybody reacts. I think we'll see action on the big four: Google, Amazon, Facebook, and those. Action from different governments where it's a global coordinated, or whether it comes from Europe or the US. But I think something's going to happen there.
It's so interesting. Yeah, Stuart. That was Stuart, right? I think I saw a green light.
Absolutely. Sorry.
No worries. Sometimes when they're not on video, I'm not too sure, but it's interesting. We talked about the Edelman Trust Monitor or Barometer the other day. It just measures, I think, for the last 20 years, like just how much do we trust people and things and organizations. And this year, big tech got battered. There seems to be a very democratic sentiment that whether it's just because they've become too big or it's because of some of the behaviors that have happened, there is a societal wide, I won't call it distrust quite yet, given what I've seen, but certainly a drop in terms of, Google could do no wrong a decade ago. Now Google needs to be looked at with a little bit of Spockian eyebrows in terms of what they're doing. So yeah, it's interesting, Stuart. Any follow-up in terms of future Grey Swans? I could go all day on this subject. I've got about 10 other backups if I needed to, but I saw somebody came off camera. Maybe Barry, you've just joined us, but we're talking, just to set our discussion halfway through it, we're talking about what are the future Grey Swans. We know what's just happened. We know some of the things that have happened in early 2021. I'm more peering into the crystal ball of the next 9 months and looking for the early signals that say, this is what might be happening.
I just thought I would listen. I came in late, obviously, and thought you were going to say what's going to happen in the next 3 to 5 years. But 9 months is good.
Well, we tend to actually take a longer time frame, but we thought for a little bit of sensationalism, because candidly, we're doing this as a sense-making experiment, but we're also entertaining people here. Sometimes the tangible is in the short term.
Like the devil is in the details. No, I'll just continue to listen. And obviously I wasn't here from the very beginning, but I'm very interested in what you guys have to say.
Welcome, Barry. Good to see you.
Welcome, Barry.
Thank you.
If I was to at least provoke people, GameStop happened in February. So we had this democratization of finance that we didn't even think was possible. Like there's no way that a subreddit post would create this wave of enthusiasm to get back at the street, and whoever was shorting stocks really took a bath if they had GameStop as part of their position. I've thought really deeply about what other democratization of an industry would happen that would really change the rules of the game. I've got one on my mind, but I'm curious if anybody that's out there has a different industry that could have the same thing experienced to them. It's a tough one to project. We can talk about what just happened last week, but it's sometimes really tough looking forward. It's like a game of golf. I find golf to be a terribly frustrating and difficult game to look at as you look at from the tee box to the hole. But when you look at the hole to the tee box, it turns out it was a very simple hole that just played mind tricks on you. So, I mean, I'll mention mine. I think the legal industry. I think we've already seen a funny thing where somebody showed up as a cat in a Zoom room on a legal discussion the other day, which I guess caused, can a cat actually be in a courtroom of law and still be taken credibly? But I really do think there will be a democratic sentiment where it's probably going to start with something banal and something maybe insignificant, like a full city will decide one day, we're just not going to pay our parking tickets, right? We just decide not to pay our parking tickets as a group of people. What's the city supposed to do? And there's Rob and his, wow, that was like 12 seconds of reaction, Rob. Very good.
I don't even know how to do that. And I write about tech. I don't know what happens if the city doesn't pay its parking tickets. They lose money and eventually they go bankrupt, as we've seen in some of the cities in the Midwest. And then they're taken over by larger municipalities. I mean,
hey Barry, how many sort of short-term 12 months out on insurance? They've had some ups and downs and what's going on, and I know you're an expert in that area.
I don't know if I'm an expert in insurance, and I am writing a book about the property casualty insurance industry and technology. I thought I'd get that plug in that Wells Media is going to publish. I'm an old guy, as you can see from the screen. So no hair, gray hair. I think that the startup insurance companies are basically just fleas on the back of an elephant. We forget just how large, maybe we forget's not the right terms, but the insurance industry, as I know you know, Rob, is humongous. $1 trillion industry, and it's even bigger than moving the Queen Mary. And it's highly regulated at all levels of government. Um, so changing the industry. And then there's the other little matter of when the startups say, well, we're going to use deep learning, we're going to use algorithms, we're going to use mobility platforms. It depends on who their targets are. And we have to remember that some of these insurance companies, a lot of them, have millions of customers. And some of those customers don't want to use mobility platforms. God forbid. And I was talking to someone who and I'm blanking on her name. She's been in the industry for about 30 years. She writes a lot about the industry. And she told me she still uses a fax machine. You could have knocked me over with a feather. It's like 2021 and you're still using a fax machine. But Rob, I know that you know, and I don't know these other folks, if we walked into an agency, an insurance agency or a broker firm today, we would see fax machines. And it just shocks the hell out of me. But there's that long trail, that the long tail in the wrong direction, if you will, of the older technologies that are still being used and the customers still want to use. Yeah. So I think that needs to be balanced with, well, we're going to use deep learning. And the other thing about deep learning that scares the hell out of me as an old insurance guy is if we're talking about property casualty, there are reasons why those algorithms really have to be very good on the underwriting side. Because when an insurance company of any stripe, and I'm only thinking about property casualty, personal, commercial, or life insurance, when they sell a policy, they're buying a claim at the same time. Oh, yeah. And so they have to be ready to have the money to pay out for that claim. So those algorithms have to be pretty good.
I remember back in 2013 when we were like, 35, that I had nudged you and I said, hey, there's going to be autonomous cars everywhere. So this is now time ago, right? And you said, Rob, you are in the wrong business. It can't happen that fast. So what's your prediction on autonomous cars?
Level 5 autonomous cars.
Level 5.
Your great grandchildren might see them.
But level 5 is purely autonomous for the folks out there that you get in the car and it takes you to Shawn's house and you go have a beer with him and it takes you back home.
I don't think so. Trucks, yes.
Trucks, yes.
But personal vehicles, no.
Well, I mean, trucks are already happening in Australia, right? Obviously,
yeah, I know that. That's why I say trucks, yes. And if you want to talk about autonomous vehicles in retirement communities and college campuses or some set geo-fenced in area, then I think you're right. But if you're thinking about a situation where 40%, 50%, 60% of the vehicles on U.S. highways and roads are level 5, yeah. I really would like to have your Kool-Aid. It's got to taste pretty damn good.
It's one of those things, and I think, Barry, as you came in, there was a slide up where it's like, short of Nostradamus, people cannot predict the future. But I will invoke another person into the discussion, Ernest Hemingway, who in his book The Sun Also Rises, somebody asked, so how did you go bankrupt? And it's like his response was, first slowly, then very quickly.
That's right.
And I think as we peer into the future, sometimes we don't worry about the environment until the polar bear is knocking on our doorstep.
You're talking about the lily pond effect, but still, we got to think about the customer adoption of the technology as well. It's one thing for the tech to be available, and it's yet another thing for customers to accept it.
Barry, I'm gonna pivot to another discussion. I know we've got a couple of insurance folks in the room.
I was gonna say I'm gonna shut up.
Well, no, there is one thing that I wonder about, just given the climate change, and we had that ranked as the number 2 thing ongoing that could be a future gray swan. Just climate impacts, both natural disaster and just the ongoing gradual glacial pace of climate. What is the prospect of me owning a coastal home in New Orleans or California, or living in the Netherlands, given what we're seeing in the coast? Because I think what may bite into how we live our lives is not necessarily the climate piece, but your ability to insure whatever piece of property that you may have.
Now, you might have to self-insure. I mean, New Orleans is in a bowl, isn't it? I mean, I tell people since we moved to Santa Fe 4 years ago, we're really thrilled to be living 7,000 feet above sea level. Not because the waters would have to rise to biblical levels, but we really like living at this altitude. Whereas New Orleans, isn't that below sea level? I mean, we don't even have to talk about climate change there. I mean, those folks are taking their physical assets, all of their assets in jeopardy by living there. Great city, great food, great environment, so to speak, in terms of culture and everything, but it's below sea level. Now, those other places, I'd have to take a look at a map, but you'd want to be able to self-insure. I mean, there are folks now, that live in California and they get burnt out and they rebuild. To me, that's shocking. If we got burnt out the first time, you couldn't even see me leaving the state so quickly.
Wonderful. Well, thanks for chiming in on that. I know Elaine in the chat has just, I think we were talking about the democratization of finance. She's included a few other industries that may be in people's crosshairs: real estate, insurance, mortgages and banking, and digital currency. I think.
By the way, when you talk about insurance, please let me know what you're talking about, because the insurance industry is not homogenous. The personal lines property casualty has different dynamics than the commercial lines property casualty. That has different dynamics than individual life. That has different dynamics than employee benefits. It's just, if you think about it as a homogenous industry, you're going to be in trouble.
Well, it's funny. I play in a hockey league with, generally it's either tech people or insurance people, and it's almost like having two different discussions, Barry. So I'm gonna keep it way up here for the just the even level of everybody. But maybe what I'm gonna do now is, we tend to focus on the negative, right? There are some negative things that may be in our front radar. We actually asked a question recently in terms of, this period during COVID has really caused us to look at things with perhaps different lenses. And we actually asked the question, what are some of the solutions over the next 10 to 20 years that have happened based on what's happened over the last year? And so we actually looked at 55 potential outcomes and solutions that might have had some positivity to them. So we're the Grey Swan Guild. We tend to open up most of our meetings with good news. We try to stay rationally optimistic about the future. So I thought we should give some even play to the good news. And so in reverse order, once again, and it's interesting, we're talking about leadership. I'll give a small plug. I know Sylvia's on right after me on Zoom. We're also having a Clubhouse session at 1 o'clock. So I get my Clark Kent cape on and go straight over to Clubhouse right after this. And we're going to talk about leadership post-COVID. But number 7 of a positive sign that's happened is we're going to actually have an era of a more authentic and humane leadership approach. And it's less about some of the old boys network and different types of things that have been generally exposed over the last few years in terms of what we don't want out of leadership. Number 6 was climate and ecological issues finally solved. So as much as it was second on the bad list, it's 6 on the, I wonder if we can apply the same level of collaboration across geographies to this climate situation. I think there's an implicit hope there.
I'm curious what you mean by finally solved, but we'll leave that for later.
Well, yes. I mean, it's, I hate to use the term, it's trying to boil the ocean, but it really is trying to boil the ocean in terms of a solution. But I think, it's not going to be one thing there for sure, Barry. Number 5 was value in real life connections and relationships. And certainly I've had my own genesis on this one, where it's like, I know neighbors now that I didn't previously know. I look out more for my local retailer than perhaps I perhaps did in the past. And I acquired a dog during the pandemic. And so lo and behold, you just start meeting a lot more people in real life than you used to when you acquire a dog. And the pet experience is not one that is singular to me, because I think one of my Grey Swan worries, or maybe it's an opportunity for dog walkers, because when we all go back to flex work, these dogs are going to be looking out their window going, who's taking care of me during the day? And I think there's a real...
Why the hell have you left me? You used to love me every hour or every minute of every hour. Now where the hell are you?
Number 4, positive work-life experiences. Generally, and this is generally, people have been hurt certainly by COVID, but generally people have appreciated the greater amount of flexibility for work-life experience. I'm looking at a set of 30 different studies I've looked at, and generally people have appreciated the fact that they can do the work on their own time. There's certainly downsides, but I think the general sentiment is they've appreciated the flexibility and not having a commute and not having to do certain things they used to. Number 3 and number 2 in terms of positive signs, emerging tech with real impact. We're actually doing e-commerce now. It's not 11% of the world that's doing e-commerce. It's a lot more. If I look at the healthcare industry in total, we went from an industry that pretty much 97% of healthcare was driven by showing up in person to a doctor, to a hospital, to what have you. And in about a 2-week period of time, we went to a universe that became 90% plus. Let's do things through some technology intermediary between us. Number 2, and this is one I think about a lot. We're doing a project called the Post-Pandemic Home, and I think part of this whole thing is where we live, right? But I think what's happened is there will be commercial real estate, there will be roads, there will be, if certainly if my car prediction is right and yours is wrong, Barry, there will be, what do we do with all of the allocation of space that we have for roads and parking, and where does that all go? And I think there is a unique opportunity here for municipal planners and developers and mayors to actually reimagine what could our downtowns and cities look like given a different lens. Anybody want to guess what the number 1 positive sign for the future is? We'll do the same thing. I'll give 30 seconds for you to consider it. Write it down in the chat if you have a thought in terms of what that looks like. And I will give you a hint. We are covering it later today in our agenda for the Grey Swan. So the day of the Swan. So I'll let that muse for a moment. And I truly believe it. I think some of us are studying this intensely. And we'll go 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. So of 55 possible long-term solutions. So we went hard on this one in terms of a question. The number 1 thing that people said will definitely change over the next 20 years for the good is the emergence of effective future of work cultures. So I think previously we talked about just work-life balance, but we really do think that entities, both public, private, and cause, will start to get to a place in time where we actually get to effectively working with the technology around us. I think in our previous chat with Gordon, AI was served up as something that could augment us, which I'm an advocate for. I think too much of what we talk about when we talk about AI is Black Mirror and just how it may take us over. That might be a question for us 50 years down the road, but over the next 10 to 15 years, I think it's all about how technology works with us, how we have a remote workforce, what does flex work look like? And I meant to bring it up in a previous session. I think Andrea ran a session at 10 o'clock today. Companies are live in fear of the fact, people won't come back to work. And I think they've misplaced the argument. I think, we term this thing FOMO, or fear of missing out. How do we have a good fear of missing out? That if you don't come into the workplace, we are going to engage you and provide you with such rich experiences and architecture. I've seen what Amazon HQ2 looks like. And certainly if you work for Amazon and you're a head office employee, they are pulling out all the stops to make sure that you try to get into that workplace just because it's so beautiful, and it's probably a much better place to do work than the closet that you're in now because your kids are actually kind of on your coattails or shirt tails. So this was the number 1 thing that people mentioned. I'm going to stop sharing on the screen in the minutes that we have left, 10 minutes. And maybe people can serve up what they think COVID has loosened in terms of a constraint and what might be one of the generation defining solutions, and maybe even with evidence if you have it. Any thoughts from the crowd?
For us, Instacart is a verb. And has been since the pandemic started. Just a thought on the number 1 that you folks have come up with. I mean, having worked in industry and having worked as a management consultant, it seems like what we're saying is that the look and feel and governance of people who work for companies, non-consulting companies, will start to look more like consulting companies, or possibly even technology firms whose, ever since I became a management consultant and then an analyst, it's remote is the way it's been. You're familiar with the hoteling and getting whatever resources you needed in the office at the time you were coming in, but the remote work was the way it was. I mean, I remember one of the executives at Arthur D. Little saying he always looked at the parking lot, and if there were too many cars in the parking lot, we were not doing enough business, because you sure as hell shouldn't be in the office.
I love that last point. I mean, there's certainly aerial photos that kind of demonstrate what the world has done just based on not their suggested behaviors, but just where the cars are actually going, right? So other thoughts from people in terms of where the future may pivot to in a positive fashion? Let me see, Howard and Chris have just joined us. You're never too shy to introduce opinions to the world, guys. Just let us know if you have some thoughts in terms of where the future positive may go.
Can you hear me?
I can.
Ah, great. Everything's working on this end. No, just one point. I think what the pandemic has done is it has helped financial executives, CFOs, to understand the value, the potential savings that they can generate by embracing things like work from anywhere. And, before, I think, Barry, I noticed you're an ex-IBMer. I'm the guy who put that program together at IBM back around 2000 or a little bit before that. The finance guys always fought with you, right? They didn't want to put another coin in the machine if they didn't have to. But I think what the pandemic has shown financial people is innovation is absolutely important. And it is a key driver of potential savings and profit for the corporation. I think that's a big change that comes out of this.
It's interesting, Howard. We saw in a previous study, we love things that support innovation just because that's kind of my livelihood. So when I run across a study that elevates the CEO's understanding of innovation being important, I kind of target those ones. The Chamber of Commerce.
By the way, you folks might have mentioned this, and I apologize if you have, but one thing that has become clear to me in the 4 years we lived here in New Mexico is the digital divide. And back home in the Boston area, if you had mentioned digital divide, I would have asked you what sort of bits and bytes you were trying to cut in which way with maybe some sort of a sharp knife. But here in New Mexico, which is a rural frontier state, fourth largest state in land area in the United States, where we have so many people in so many parts of the state that either do not have any kind of broadband. We don't even talk about running water, electricity. They just are without. And so they are definitely in the dark hole of the digital divide. Something I took for granted back home in the Boston area. Of course we have broadband. How could we not? Here, it's a question. It's not a question, it's an issue.
I completely worry about it too, Barry, from the standpoint from just if you take the transportation sector alone, and if we forget about technology for a moment and just look at taxis and what has happened there, you've got about 10 million people that their livelihood depends on transportation in the States. That is a business that's becoming certainly more technology driven, even if we don't go down the road of autonomous automobiles.
Now, on the other side of that, Shawn, on the other side of what Barry was referencing, what I'm really optimistic about is Starlink for connecting those same distant rural communities to the rest of the world very easily. And it's already started in Western Canada, and I think up by you guys now, and here in the Pacific Northwest in the US.
There is would you agree, Chris? There is I worry about sometimes we have these principally white collar discussions around how emancipating this great digital world's going to be. And yet there's an entire, other world out there that will require, if not months, years of retraining, and not only retraining, but a cultural mindset of the importance of technology to them. Like I sometimes worry that we leave behind people in these discussions.
Well, just as we leave behind employees inside enterprises when technologies are deployed without any training plans, it seems to be a constant problem in humanity right now that we don't invest enough in preparing our people for the future. And I think that's actually another positive that came out of this pandemic is that a lot of the job losses that would come from AI and other advances were accelerated a little bit, and really seeing a sense of what might happen is getting people into that mindset of retraining and learning new skills and finding new opportunities. So
and I am thank you, Chris, and really positive today. You've got your positive going, your coffee going on in the Silicon Valley today. Like usually, like not until the PM do we get like kind of the Liza Minnelli version of Chris Hewers. So this is great. We do have some chat going on here. Monica has wondered about aging. If we are now living all healthier, and as the point made by Gordon earlier, like our food, if this habit sticks, we principally have eaten a little bit better during this pandemic, outside of alcohol consumption going up a little, which we're probably not helping today with our cocktail hour.
I thought the CDC, at least I thought the CDC showed that people were gaining an average of 2 pounds.
But they're also getting out there. They're getting out in the outdoors, and they're getting more fit. And so it's almost things going in the same direction. But if we do have the average age of a human going up to, let's say, plausibly up to 100 years, what does that mean to all of the things that we've got around? Well, Barry, you've got an insurance game. We've also got, whatever you call it in your country in terms of old age pensions. And, are they supposed to last for 50 years, old age pensions? It used to be in Canada, we had this big commercial called Freedom 55. London Life had this Freedom 55 commercial where right now, I mean, some of us, if you retire at 55, you need a pension that's going to last you for 45 years to get you
Social
out.
Security is not going to cut it. And I started out on the life side, even though for the last decade or so, I've really concentrated more on property casualty. But I started out on the life side, and I was trained that there was a three-legged stool, that you had Social Security, which you were not supposed to depend on entirely. You had your pensions from the companies that you work for, and you had your investments. That's the theory. The problem is, and it's a severe problem, is that the average savings of people heading into retirement in the United States is woefully low. They just haven't bought enough. They haven't invested enough. Obviously, they don't necessarily have the money to invest. So pensions writ large is going to be a problem as people age in the United States.
Yep.
And that's even assuming they don't need long-term care. We'll leave that out of the discussion because the government does not provide that either.
I think there may be implications, Barry, in terms of retirement age, in terms of how technology maybe can play a role in that. I do want to give some justice to some of the other comments too in the chat stream here. Ashley, my good friend Ashley, talks about the future of food in terms of restaurants and how we'll have the introduction of a lot of different ghost kitchens and meal replacement kitchens, as opposed to necessarily sitting down for your steak dinner and spending $28 at your local steakhouse in the future.
We are seeing a growth in ghost kitchens here in Santa Fe.
Right. And there's a worry beat on that one as well. I did a project recently on the future of gyms. I think we've predicted more than 10% of the retail universe is just going to be gone coming out of COVID, even with any kind of support systems. Gyms are upwards to about 40% of them, like 40% of them just won't be able to survive this. And so, which has probably caused the introduction of things like mirror and tonal and things that function in your living room as the future of your gyms. And so
because the gyms are nothing more than one large petri dish, or because people are going to be concerned about catching viruses or other diseases.
Yep. Alexandra, I know you're on. I'm not too sure if you're unmute yourself if you're there, because I know we've talked about the post-pandemic home a lot, and just to give that a little bit of airplay, because I know if there's anybody in the world right now I would turn to who knows where the home will be in 2030, Alexandra's on my really short calling card list. So, and she was also pivotal in our Spanish speaking session today at 9 o'clock, even though she didn't speak Spanish in it. So, Alexandra, thoughts on the future home, and just give us a glimpse of where you think that Grey Swan may be.
Yeah, hey guys. I am going to bring up sort of a Grey Swan for the home. I'm thinking about a home that's, more than just smart, but maybe like connected to you, a home that you literally control with your mind, or, maybe it controls you a little bit with the advent of these personal digital assistants and so forth. Yeah, how about that?
I love it. And it feels like a Star Trek for me. Myself and Rob always debate. He's a Star Wars guy. I'm a Star Trek guy. Essentially anything Gene Roddenberry ever invented has come to life. And I think as we look at the home, Alexandra, I keep waiting for my mirror in the morning. Like when I get up in the morning, just to have a digital readout of what might confront me and what might be the most important things to my life. Maybe it's more George Jetson, where I get hit with a newspaper coming out of my bed down to the funnel, down to my kitchen. Is that the type of world we're looking at 10 years from now?
You know, I think it's a huge possibility considering COVID and so many signals out there that suggest we're not done with global pandemics. And in fact, we may be entering this sort of positive compounding feedback loop of pandemics as climate change progresses. So I think it's possible that along with track and trace type programs and along with various wearables and GPS type efforts at controlling epidemics or pandemics, it could be very much based from within the home itself. You know, whether it's a mirror or whether it's something that prevents you from leaving the house if you have a fever, or something that, you know, you have to scan your kid before you can put them on the school bus or what have you, because we're all already going through those questionnaires, right? You can't enter a place like doctor's appointments and stuff without answering, okay, no, I haven't had a fever and I have this and that. So, and it could be a variety of conditions. It may not be pandemic. It could be climate. There could be a reason why your house would stop you from leaving that day because air quality is bad, or there's too much ultraviolet light and it isn't safe, something like that. So I would be looking in that direction in terms of the home, how it's becoming, you know, big brother / big mother is one of the continuums I like to look at. Big brother being the one that's scary and evil and wants to control you, and big mother being the one that wants to take care of you and do what's best for you and encourage you to do what's best for you. So I would look at that sort of, you know, continuum of the home, controlling us or helping us.
That's fascinating.
Inside of that one,
Before we go there, I have to give respect to the next session, and this could be a 2-hour session, but this is the assembly line of 24 hours, and we are about to have an amazing session on here that our captain, I guess Agustin, our captain now, you're going to present. So
I'm here, and I'm going to Clubhouse also, so we are all over the place.
Well, thank you for joining us in this discussion, and I'll give it over to my captain, my brother from Uruguay, to introduce our next session.
Thanks so much for being here. Again, we are with the celebration of the year of Grey Swan Guild, and now, well, I don't have the